Hi, everyone. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about Fire and Blood, which is the in-universe historical text in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe. And particularly, I wanted to talk about the section on the Dance of the Dragons, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is the source books for the new show House of the Dragon. And particularly, sort of like my other A Song of Ice and Fire videos, I'm going to be approaching this from a bit of a historical lens, using my familiarity with real-world medieval archaeology, and in this case, real-world medieval history. And sort of specifically what we'll be looking at is perhaps a bit of what we might consider historiography, although this is a little outside of my field, so don't try not to be too harsh in judging my analysis. But we're going to be looking at the ideas of biases in our historical text. So to quickly give a recap, like I said, the book Fire and Blood is an in-universe text that is meant to be a history of the Targaryen dynasty. So rather than being sort of an out-of-world text where everything is sort of objective, this is being written by a character in the universe, and potentially one of our characters in the main A Song of Ice and Fire narrative could pick up and read the same book that we have. And this is usually thought of as potentially bringing some biases, because most texts are biased in some way, and even in the modern age where we try our best to sort of be objective about history, the biases of whoever's writing that history are going to come through every once in a while. And this is a problem that's sort of much more prevalent in older historical works. So when you look at historical tales from the Middle Ages, somebody in medieval times looking back at their own history, these biases can become even more prevalent, and a lot of times are the true purpose of the historical narrative. That these aren't meant to provide sort of an objective historical account in the way that sort of a modern historian would, but rather these are being produced as propaganda texts for specific dynasties, for specific rulers, or for other specific causes. So, for instance, if we take two of our most prominent sort of medieval Irish historical texts, these are sort of coming from the Middle Irish period. You have the victorious career of Celicán of Cashel, which is, again, sort of a 12th century text, most likely about the war between the Irish and the Vikings. And it's really all about sort of glorifying a particular dynasty in the south of Ireland called Owenachta. So, in theory, it's about how great these Owenachta warriors were at fighting off the invading Vikings. But it's not just because this is a solid historical tract and this is literally how things happened, but it's pretty well understood as being a propaganda tract being pushed by these Owenachta as a way to sort of justify their position as the rulers in the south of Ireland, is because, look at how glorious our dynasty has been. We've done all of these really cool things like fighting off the Vikings. And it was written as a response to another historical tract, which has the much sort of more boring title, I suppose, of The War of the Irish with the Foreigners, which is very similar. It's about the Viking invasions into the south of Ireland, and about the Southern Irish kings fighting off the Vikings, and is particularly glorifying the famous King Brian Boru, who is quite a well-known Irish historical figure. If you know any sort of medieval Irish kings, he'll probably be the one. And it's all about Brian Boru, again, fighting the Vikings, pushing them out of the south of Ireland, and in a lot of ways becoming what we might consider the first High King, the first king ruling over all of Ireland, although even then that's not particularly true. So we can really understand these two tracks, not just as wanting to preserve the history and write what happened during the time of the Viking raids in Ireland, but really it's sort of a propaganda war were these two different dynasties, the Oanakta, who wrote The Victorious Career of Kellachan of Cashel, and the Dalcash, who write the War of the Irish with the foreigners, and they're both sort of trying to amplify, their historical past to make themselves seem a lot more glorious and a lot more sort of responsible for Southern Ireland's success against the Vikings as a way to justify the current political climate. Trying to justify which one of these dynasties, has the most claim to being the kingship over the south of Ireland. You can see this actually in a lot of historical narratives, both in Ireland and abroad. So another very popular Irish high king, both in sort of the Middle Ages itself, and again today as a sort of folkloric figure, is Neil of the Nine Hostages, who, according to legend, unified all of Ireland at some point in. Usually thought to be in roughly the 5th century. He goes and invades Britain, he invades the continent, he does all sorts of cool stuff that probably didn't actually happen. And the reason why he becomes such a popular figure is because his descendants, a sort of dynastic branch called the Enail, are the power in the north of Ireland, and throughout the Middle Ages try to exert their authority into the south of Ireland, and again create a sort of unified single high kingship over the island. So again, you can see that these stories about the past, or in this case a more semi-mythic past, are, again, it's not just about the past, it's about their present. It's about trying to glorify and provide propaganda for their dynasty, for the Ynael. And if we look over at Britain, of course, the sort of most famous historical text from the Middle Ages is the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written by a monk called Bede, living in roughly the Viking Age in the north of England. And again, while this is theoretically, a simple account of sort of the coming of the English into what is now England, as well as their conversion to Christianity, hence the ecclesiastical history part. It does go a lot to sort of justify, these sort of things, that, they aren't just roving barbarians who conquered Rome and Britain, as sort of we think of the Anglo-Saxon invasions today, but it does a lot to justify, sort of portraying the Welsh in a very negative light as people who had, to some extent, abandoned Christianity. They were theoretically Christian, but, they didn't go to church and do good Christian things. So the English are sort of a divine retribution against the Welsh when they show up. And then once they become converted to Christianity, unlike those Welshmen who are, out being sinful, it portrays the English conversion as very good and, a particular positive light on Oswald, the king and saint in Northumbria. So again, it's sort of using this sort of religious history as a bit of a way to sort of justify that current political order where the English are sort of the dominant faction in Britain, and definitely in sort of Britain outside of Scotland. So when it comes to Fire and Blood, and particularly the section dealing with the Dance of the Dragon, a lot of readers do understand that this is an unreliable historical narrative and that it is being used for sort of propaganda purposes. This is something that gets discussed a lot in the fandom, is, what biases does Glydayn, the in-universe author of the text, have, and how is that being shown in the text? And particularly, there's a lot of debate over how he's portraying the two factions in the dance, the blacks and the greens. And there's even a sort of a bit of contention in the fandom as to whether, his bias is sort of pro-green or pro-black. Which side is he portraying in a negative light? Which side is he for? It's understood that there's definitely a historical bias here, that, it's sort of being written as a bit of a propaganda tract. And the question is, which side of this conflict is it propaganda for? Because both sides in the fandom sort of see it as biased against their side and, see biases that are for the other side. And I think that's actually kind of missing the point of the text. Because again, if we go back to the real world historical examples, when they do propaganda, it's not actually propaganda about the past. So like sure, the stories of Kalakan are about Kalakan, and it is trying to portray him in a good light. But it's not just Kalakan is great; we should all like him. But it brings it back to the present when the text is being written down. Kalakan is great; we should all like him, and therefore we need to have his descendants, the Oanakta, be the true rulers. And likewise, if you look at the other texts, Bede isn't just the Welsh kind of suck, the English are great, and that's why things happened hundreds of years ago. We can sort of understand this as justifying the current political order, as well as all those other texts. It's not just that Niall of the Nine Hostages is great, it's that the Enail, who are descendant of Niall of the Nine Hostages, are great and should be king. It's not just that Brian Boru is great, it's that the Dalcash, who are descendant of Brian Boru, are great and should be king. So when we look at this text in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe, if we're looking at sort of the Dance of the Dragon section of Fire and Blood, and we're looking for historical biases, like part of that is indeed saying, whether or not he's supporting a particular faction in this conflict, but it's not just, he liked the Greens, hundreds of years ago when this happened, but what does him liking the Greens hundreds of years ago in this conflict mean for who he's trying to support in the current political conflicts? And I think that's something that a lot of fans are sort of missing, is we're still focusing on sort of the political biases and how it portrays different past factions, but we're ignoring what it might mean for the present. So let's dig into the A Song of Ice and Fire universe for a little bit. So if we're looking at sort of a historical context for this writing, which I think we do need to understand if we're going to properly assess any political biases in a medieval or medieval style text, sort of the natural question is, what is the historical context for this? And unfortunately, we don't have too much information. According to sort of a few, like, sort of semi-canon sources, as they're called, sort of the So Speaks Martin and stuff like that, the generally accepted idea that seems to be throughout the fandom is that Glydayn lived into the reign of King Robert, is around either in or not too long before the sort of events of the main series of A Song of Ice and Fire books. Which means he likely would have been writing either in the reign of King Robert or in the reign of the Mad King. And I think this gives us a much better understanding of sort of the political context. Because, of course, if you're writing during the reign of King Robert, then any political biases are probably going to be anti-Targaryen, at least in official narratives that are getting the support of the king. And we know Robert is not exactly sort of a peaceful king. He's very openly, hates the Targaryens and isn't a fan of Targaryen supporters, a lot of whom we meet at the Wall. So, if it's being written during the time of King Robert, it would make sense that any political biases aren't just, anti a particular Targaryen faction, but anti-Targaryen overall. And even if it's written during the Mad King, of course, while you couldn't be as openly anti-Targaryen, the Mad King isn't well liked even during his day. He even gets kidnapped by one of his vassals at one point. And you have a growing anti-Targaryen sentiment. And if you follow other fan theories, there's a common idea that the Targaryen, or that the Targaryens are being worked against by the Citadel and by sort of Old Town. So it would make sense that just before obviously this is a bit of being in hindsight, that, there's this rebellion against the Targaryen kings that is thought to have been in a lot of ways manipulated by Old Town, sort of by the Maesters and by the Citadels, that if they're writing a history of the Targaryens, they're not actually going to want to portray the Targaryens in too good of a light. That again, this is a piece of historical propaganda, but it's not that it's actually pro-black or pro-green. It's just anti-Targaryen as a whole, which I think makes a lot of sense. It fits both with sort of both of the historical context that we have, would seem to want to be a situation where Old Town is anti-Targaryen, and since it's being produced probably in Old Town during those times, it would make sense for the text to have anti-Targaryen biases, and it could explain why, sort of in the fandom, both pro-green and pro-black fans see a bias against their respective party, or possibly for their respective parties, depending on who you ask. Is because it's not actually attacking a particular faction, but it's portraying both factions in a way to sort of say, no matter which Targaryen family wins this power struggle, the fact that it's still Targaryen kings is quite bad. And this is also again fits in some of the details of fan theories, where there's some idea that things like the tourney at Harrenhal are being put on by Rhaegar, sort of in an attempt to build support for a future Targaryen war, because he wants to overthrow this Targaryen king, the Mad King, and sort of replace it with himself, who is much more well liked and probably not insane, or at least not as insane. So during a time where there's a possible upcoming sort of Targaryen feud, and the ultimate end of not having a particular person win that Targaryen feud, rather have both Targaryen sides of this conflict removed and a non-Targaryen king put up, producing a historical text that says no matter who wins in a in a Targaryen feud, it's really bad. Both sides of the Targaryen feud are bad for Westeros, and are bad rulers, is quite a powerful message. So I think that if we sort of understand uh, Fire and Blood as a medieval historical text, which is to say its biases aren't pro or against sort of past political ideologies, but are pro or against current at the time of writing political conflicts, then it would make more sense to understand the text not as being pro green or anti green, but as pro Targaryen and anti Targaryen. I think this is a good way where sort of the negative light that's being showed on both factions is a way of the text being anti Targaryen as a whole. So that's my theory, and I look forward to seeing what you all think in the comments down below.